My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 now, and the day my parents decided not to attend my wedding started in a very ordinary way. I was standing in my kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning, making coffee while the sun came through the blinds. The smell of toasted bread filled the apartment, and my phone buzzed on the counter beside the sink. It was a message from my father. Just one line. If you don't move the wedding date, don't expect us to be there. I read it once. Then again. The coffee machine kept humming behind me. I didn't respond right away. I just set the phone face down on the counter and stood there for a moment, looking out the window at the parking lot below. Because the date he was talking about wasn't random. It was a date my fiancé and I had reserved 18 months earlier. A date connected to contracts, deposits, invitations, and 200 people who had already made travel plans. And the reason my parents wanted it moved was simple. My younger sister had scheduled a wellness retreat in Hawaii during the same week. That morning, I didn't argue. I didn't panic either. I simply stared at the message and thought quietly to myself that something about this situation felt unfinished. There was also one other detail sitting quietly in the background of my mind. Something my husband, Daniel, had discovered a few weeks earlier while looking through a set of financial records. At the time, I didn't realize how important those records would become. But later that night, in front of more than 100 guests, those documents would change everything people thought they knew about my family. The story really started almost 2 years earlier. December 2023. Daniel proposed on a cool evening in Liberty Park in Salt Lake City. Snow was melting along the walking paths, and the air had that sharp winter smell you only get in the mountains. He had brought a small blanket and a thermos of hot chocolate. Nothing elaborate, just quiet and thoughtful. When he opened the small ring box, I remember noticing how calm he looked. I said yes immediately. The next morning, I called my parents. My mother sounded emotional. My father congratulated us and said something that, at the time, felt reassuring. "We'll help however we can," he said. I believed him. Looking back now, I sometimes wish I had recorded that call. But at that point, everything still felt normal. About a week later, my mother invited me to lunch at their house. My parents lived in a large home in the Sugar House neighborhood, the same place where my sister and I had grown up. The house always smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and polished wood. My mother kept everything spotless. During lunch, she placed her wine glass down and looked at me with a small smile. "There's something you should know," she said. I remember pausing with my fork halfway to my mouth. She explained that my grandparents had left behind a wedding trust when they passed away in 2019, a fund set aside for their first grandchild to marry. The amount was $100,000. I sat there quietly for a moment, trying to process that. My grandparents had always been careful planners. They believed in preparing for things years ahead of time. According to my mother, the trust was meant to help with wedding expenses, a home down payment, or the start of married life. And since I was the oldest grandchild, the beneficiary was me. My father nodded from the other side of the table. "That money is yours when the time comes," he said. I remember feeling a mix of gratitude and relief. Weddings are expensive, and Daniel and I were paying for most things ourselves. Knowing there was help waiting made everything feel easier. For the first time in a long time, I thought maybe my parents were truly supportive. Daniel and I spent the next few months visiting venues. We drove all over northern Utah. Barns, hotels, gardens, country clubs. Some places were beautiful but far too expensive. Others were available but didn't feel right. Then one afternoon in April, we visited a venue overlooking the foothills just outside the city. It had wide glass windows, wooden beams, and a terrace that faced the mountains. The late afternoon sunlight filled the room with this warm golden color. When we stepped inside, Daniel squeezed my hand. "This is the one," he said quietly. I felt the same thing immediately. The venue had one date available that worked for us. October 18th, 2025. We signed the contract that afternoon and paid the deposit from our savings. A week later, we mailed out save the date cards to our friends and family. My parents received theirs the same day as everyone else. My mother texted me a picture of it. "Perfect date," she wrote. "Fall will be beautiful." I saved that message without really thinking about it. At the time, it just felt like a normal conversation. My younger sister, Lily, is 3 years younger than me. Growing up, she always had a way of drawing attention without trying very hard. She ran a travel and lifestyle page online, photos of beaches, cafes, and yoga retreats. My parents loved it. They called it her creative career. Lily had nearly 150,000 followers at the time. Most of her income came from partnerships and sponsorships my parents helped her manage. Meanwhile, I worked as a program coordinator for a nonprofit mentoring organization. I enjoyed my job. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Still, in our family dynamic, Lily was often treated like the exciting one. I was the dependable one. I had gotten used to that over the years. So when the trouble started the following summer, it didn't completely surprise me. But I still didn't expect it to unfold the way it did. In July 2025, 3 months before the wedding, my mother called while I was leaving work. The heat outside had turned the pavement soft, and I remember leaning against my car while I answered. Her tone sounded careful. "Emily," she said, "we need to talk about the wedding date." I asked what she meant. There was a pause. Then she explained that Lily had booked a 2-week wellness retreat in Hawaii. It overlapped with the wedding. The trip, she said, was important for Lily's brand partnerships. And then she asked the question, "Would you consider moving the wedding to next spring?" I remember staring across the parking lot, watching a delivery truck pull away. The request didn't make sense. The venue had been booked for over a year. Contracts were signed. Invitations had been mailed. Nearly 200 guests had already confirmed. So I answered calmly. "No," I said. "We can't move it." There was a long silence on the line. Then my mother said something I still remember word for word. "This is about family, Emily." A moment later, she added quietly, "Sometimes you have to make sacrifices for your sister." I didn't argue. I just listened. Because at that moment, I had a strange feeling that this conversation was only the beginning of something much bigger. And later that night, Daniel would open his laptop and show me something that made the situation suddenly very clear. Then I waited. That evening, Daniel came home later than usual. The apartment was quiet when he walked in. The living room lamps were on, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of me. I hadn't written anything in it. I had just been turning the pen slowly between my fingers. He set his laptop bag down near the door and looked at me. "You talked to your mom?" he asked. I nodded. He walked over, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. "What happened?" I repeated the conversation almost word for word. I kept my voice steady, the way I usually do when I'm trying to sort through something instead of reacting to it. When I finished, Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked thoughtful. Then he pulled out a chair and sat across from me. "I had a feeling something like this might happen," he said quietly. That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering immediately, he opened his laptop and turned it toward me. The screen showed a folder filled with scanned documents, bank statements, trust paperwork, transaction summaries. I looked at him. "You've been looking into the wedding trust?" He nodded once. "I wanted to understand how it was structured," he said. "Just in case." Daniel works as a financial analyst. His job is basically to notice patterns in numbers and paperwork that most people overlook. He's calm about it. Methodical. Not suspicious, just careful. He opened one document and highlighted a section. "This is the trust your grandparents created," he said. "It names you as the primary beneficiary." I leaned closer. The language was clear. The trust funds were to be released when the first grandchild married, with the money used for wedding expenses or to help start married life. That part one already knew. Then Daniel opened another document. A bank ledger connected to the trust account. "This is where things get interesting," he said. He scrolled slowly down the screen. At first, everything looked normal. Deposits, interest payments, routine maintenance entries. Then he stopped on a line dated July 18th, 2025. A withdrawal. The amount was large enough that it stood out immediately. $70,000. I felt my stomach tighten slightly. "Where did it go?" I asked. Daniel clicked the transaction. Another document opened beside it. The recipient name appeared clearly in the transfer record. Lily Carter. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The quiet in the room felt heavier than it had a few minutes earlier. That can't be right, I said. Daniel didn't rush to correct me. Instead, he opened the trust paperwork again and pointed to a specific clause. The trustees are your parents, he said. They can manage the account, but legally they're required to act in the beneficiary's best interest. I followed his finger across the page. The wording was precise. Careful. Lily isn't the beneficiary, I said slowly. Daniel shook his head. No, he said. She isn't. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. The date of the transfer sat in my mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. July 18th. 5 days before my parents asked me to move the wedding. So they already moved the money, I said quietly. Daniel nodded. It looks that way. I felt an odd calm settle over me. Not anger. Not panic. Just clarity. My parents had told me that the wedding fund depended on cooperation with the family. But according to the documents in front of us, the money had already been partially distributed. And not to me. Daniel closed the laptop gently. I wasn't sure if I should show you yet, he said. I'm glad you did. For a few minutes, we just sat there quietly. Outside, a car passed on the street. The sound faded quickly. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind. Is it legal? Daniel considered that. It depends on the trustee authority, he said carefully. But if the trust clearly names you as beneficiary, giving most of it to someone else could be a serious problem. I looked down at the table. The wood grain ran in long straight lines beneath my hands. Okay, I said. He studied my face. You're calmer than I expected. I shrugged slightly. Getting angry won't change what already happened. Then I asked another question. Do we have copies of everything? Daniel smiled faintly. I made several. That was when the situation shifted for me. Not emotionally. Practically. Because suddenly the problem looked less like a family argument and more like a system with facts, records, and timelines. I picked up my pen again and opened the notebook. Daniel watched as I wrote 3 short lines. Step 1, keep all documents. Step 2, do nothing immediately. Step 3, wait and observe. He raised an eyebrow. You're making a plan. I'm organizing information, I said. Then I closed the notebook. We still have a wedding to finish planning. And for the next few weeks, that's exactly what we did. August passed quietly. My parents stopped answering my calls. Text messages were read but ignored. My sister continued posting travel photos online, beach sunsets, yoga sessions, cafe tables with ocean views. My parents liked every post. They didn't acknowledge any of my wedding updates. I noticed the pattern, but I didn't comment on it. Instead, Daniel and I finalized seating charts, confirmed catering, and reviewed the schedule with the venue coordinator. Everything moved forward exactly as planned. Until one afternoon in early October, 8 days before the wedding. That was when an email arrived from the venue coordinator that changed the entire direction of the story. I opened it while sitting at my desk at work. The subject line read, Urgent, clarification needed. I clicked it open. The message was polite but direct. She explained that someone claiming to represent the bride's family had contacted the venue multiple times asking about rescheduling the event. Attached were copies of the emails. All 3 were from my mother, and the last one included a sentence I read twice before fully understanding it. This wedding should not proceed on that date. I sat back slowly in my chair. Then I forwarded the email to Daniel. A minute later, my phone rang. He didn't say hello when I answered. He just said quietly, I think it's time we prepare for the reception. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. During the past 2 weeks, he had already started building a presentation. Not emotional, not dramatic, just organized facts, documents, transfers, emails, a timeline. And when he finished explaining it, the room around me felt very still. Because suddenly the wedding reception didn't look like a celebration anymore. It looked like the place where the truth might finally be explained. Then I closed my laptop and waited. The week before the wedding moved slowly. Not in a stressful way. More like the quiet feeling you get when something important is approaching and you're simply waiting for the right moment. Daniel worked in the evenings at the dining table with his laptop open. I could hear the soft clicking of keys while I finalized seating arrangements and vendor confirmations. We didn't talk about the presentation every night, but it was there. Organized. Growing. One evening, I walked into the living room and saw the first slide on Daniel's screen. Plain black background. White text. Nothing flashy. Just a title. Timeline of events. He noticed me standing there and rotated the laptop slightly so I could see. "I'm keeping it simple," he said. I nodded. "Facts only. That's the idea." He clicked forward to the next slide. A scanned copy of the trust document appeared. Highlighted lines showed the section naming the beneficiary. Me. Then the following slide showed the account activity. A single line circled in yellow. July 18th, $70,000 transfer. Recipient. Lily Carter. Daniel didn't add commentary. He didn't need to. The document spoke for itself. He continued clicking. Emails. Text messages. The venue coordinator's message. The timeline slowly forming a pattern. Watching it appear in order felt different from reading the documents individually. Together they told a story without anyone needing to explain it. I sat down across from him. "How many slides?" I asked. "Probably around 20. "That's thorough." Daniel smiled slightly. "Clarity helps." The next few days continued normally on the surface. Hair appointment confirmations. Final menu selections. The florist calling to confirm delivery times. Friends texting about travel plans. From the outside, everything looked like a typical wedding week. But there was another quiet layer underneath. Daniel refining the presentation. Checking dates. Verifying bank records. Organizing everything so that no one could misunderstand what they were seeing. On October 17th, the night before the wedding, we finished packing the last few things for the venue. Shoes. Garment bags. A folder containing the marriage license. And one other folder Daniel placed carefully inside his laptop case. I noticed it immediately. "Copies?" I asked. "3 sets," he said. "Why 3? "In case someone wants to review them later." I understood what he meant. Witnesses. Documentation. Process. I poured 2 glasses of water and sat on the couch. The apartment felt unusually quiet. Daniel closed his laptop and sat beside me. "This is the last chance to stop," he said. His voice was calm. Not persuasive. Just factual. We could ignore everything and just enjoy the wedding. I thought about that for a moment. It would certainly be easier. But then I remembered the email my mother had sent the venue. The transfer record. The silence that followed every message I'd tried to send. I shook my head. "No," I said. Daniel nodded once. Then he stood and began organizing the laptop bag again. As he zipped it closed, he paused. "Oh," he said. "There's one more thing." He opened the bag again and pulled out his phone. Another transaction showed up while I was reviewing the statements earlier. He handed the phone to me. The transfer was recent. September 10th, $14,800. Source account, my father's personal account. Recipient, Lily Carter Travel Services. The memo line read, "Hawaii Retreat Extension." I stared at it for a moment. Then I handed the phone back. "So the trip wasn't just hers," I said quietly. Daniel nodded. "They paid for it." The irony settled in slowly. My parents had told me they couldn't support the wedding. At the same time, they had extended my sister's vacation. I stood up and walked to the kitchen sink. Outside, the streetlights were already on. The sky had turned that deep navy color just before full night. Daniel joined me at the counter. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. And I meant it, because by that point the situation didn't feel confusing anymore. It felt documented. And documentation has a way of removing emotion from a problem. I turned off the kitchen light. "Let's get some sleep," I said. "We have a long day tomorrow." The wedding morning began quietly. I woke up in the bridal suite at the venue around 6:30 a.m. The room smelled faintly like fresh linens and coffee from the hallway. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. I checked my phone. No messages from my parents. No messages from my sister. Just a few good luck texts from friends. At 9:30 a.m., one of my bridesmaids walked in with coffee and pastries. The room slowly filled with conversation and laughter as everyone prepared for the day. Hair appointments. Makeup kits spread across the vanity. Music playing softly from someone's phone. I tried not to think about the empty seats that might appear later. At 2 p.m., I stood in front of the mirror wearing the dress for the first time that day. Ivory fabric. Lace sleeves. Nothing overly dramatic. Just simple and comfortable. My maid of honor zipped the back carefully. "You look calm," she said. "I feel calm." She smiled. "That's impressive." But the truth was simple. The most difficult part of the situation had already happened weeks earlier. What remained now was just the timeline playing out. At 3:30 p.m., someone knocked on the door. It was my uncle, my father's younger brother. A tall man with gray hair and kind eyes. 2 days earlier, I had asked if he would walk me down the aisle. My father had declined. My uncle had accepted immediately. He stepped inside the room and adjusted his tie. "Ready?" he asked. I took his arm. "Ready." As we walked toward the ceremony area, I glanced through a side window. Guests were already seated outside. And near the back row, I saw them. My parents. Sitting far from the front. Not speaking to anyone. 2 empty chairs remained in the first row where they were supposed to be. I didn't react. I simply looked forward again. The ceremony music began. Then the doors opened. And I walked down the aisle toward Daniel. The ceremony itself was simple. The officiant spoke calmly. The wind moved gently through the trees around the terrace. Daniel's hands were warm when he held mine. Everything felt steady. Until one moment. Near the middle of the ceremony. The officiant paused and asked the traditional question. If anyone objects, he barely finished the sentence. Because behind us a chair moved. My father stood. His voice was loud enough for the entire terrace to hear. "Emily," he said. "Your mother, and I won't be part of this mistake." Then he turned and walked down the aisle. My mother followed him, crying loudly as they left. For a moment, the entire ceremony went silent. I didn't turn around. I didn't say anything. I simply looked at the officiant and said quietly, "Please continue." And the ceremony did continue. Daniel and I exchanged vows. We placed rings on each other's fingers. And a few minutes later, the officiant pronounced us married. Guests applauded softly. Some looked confused. Others looked sympathetic. But the ceremony was over. And the reception would begin in a few hours. Later that evening, after dinner had been served and the toasts were about to start, Daniel stood up from our table. He walked calmly to the DJ booth with his laptop. I watched him connect the cable to the projector screen. Guests assumed it was the slideshow we had mentioned earlier. Photos from our childhood. Memories. The usual wedding material. Daniel returned to the table and leaned slightly toward me. One last time, he said quietly, "We can still skip it." I looked across the room. More than 100 people were sitting at their tables. Friends, family, neighbors, witnesses. Then I nodded. "Go ahead." At 8:15 p.m., Daniel stood and picked up the microphone. The room grew quiet. Behind him, the projector screen turned black. Then the first slide appeared, and the room began to lean forward in their chairs. The ballroom was quiet in a way I'll probably never forget. Not tense exactly, just attentive. The kind of silence that happens when people think they're about to see one thing and then realize very quickly they're about to see something else. Daniel stood near the screen with one hand around the microphone and the small presentation remote in the other. The light from the projector caught the side of his face. He looked composed, very still. He thanked everyone for staying after what had happened at the ceremony. A few people gave small, uncertain smiles. Then he said, in the same calm tone he always uses when he's explaining numbers at the kitchen table, "Something happened today that makes the rest of this evening difficult to treat as normal. I'm not interested in making a scene. I am interested in making the record clear." That sentence changed the room. People stopped shifting in their chairs. They settled. The first slide stayed on the screen for a few seconds longer. Timeline of events, white text. Black background. Simple. Daniel clicked to the next slide. A scam section of my grandparents' trust appeared, the beneficiary language highlighted in pale yellow. He didn't dramatize it. He just read the relevant line exactly as written. The fund was designated for the first grandchild to marry, to be used for wedding expenses or to help establish married life. Then he looked back at the room and said, "That beneficiary is Emily." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. A few people exchanged glances. I saw my aunt in the second row of tables straighten in her chair and fold her hands together tightly. Then the next slide came up. The trust ledger. A clean scan, easy to read from across the room. Daniel had enlarged the single line that mattered. July 18th, 2025, transfer, $70,000 recipient. Lily Carter. There was an audible shift in the room then. Not a gasp all at once. More like a ripple of breath. Forks were set down. Someone near the back whispered, "Wait." Daniel let the silence stay for a moment before speaking again. "This transfer happened 5 days before Emily was asked to move the wedding," he said. At that point, the money had already been moved. He clicked again. The next slide showed the trust clause beside the transfer record. Side by side. Expectation and action. I remember thinking, sitting there in my wedding dress under soft amber lighting, that the whole thing looked less like an accusation and more like an audit. That was the point. No speeches. No emotional argument. Just sequence. Just evidence. Daniel moved forward carefully, one item at a time. He showed the text messages from my father telling me not to expect financial support. He showed the date stamps. Then he showed the email chain from the venue coordinator. My mother's messages appeared enlarged on the screen. The room was so quiet I could hear the projector fan. One email asked about moving the date. The next asked what penalties would apply. The third said plainly that the wedding should not proceed on that date. A woman at one of the far tables covered her mouth with her hand. Someone else said, quietly but clearly, she tried to cancel it. Daniel did not answer that question for them. He simply clicked to the next slide. A timeline appeared. Left side, the venue booked 18 months earlier. Then invitations mailed. Then my sister's retreat dates. Then the transfer from the trust. Then the demand to move the wedding. Then the emails to the venue. Then the text from my father withdrawing support. Every date sat in a neat vertical line. Facts have a way of removing confusion when they're placed in order. I watched people reading it for themselves. That part mattered to me. No one was being asked to take sides emotionally. They were being asked to observe what had happened. Daniel paused there and took a sip of water. When he spoke again, his voice was even quieter than before. "I want to be fair," he said. "So I'll keep this simple." He clicked to a slide I hadn't seen in that exact format. At the top, it read, 3 points below it, in plain text: 1. The trust named one beneficiary. 2. The money was transferred elsewhere. 3. The beneficiary was then told she had chosen disrespect by not changing her wedding date. That was the first moment I felt the full shift in the room. Because until then, people had been processing information. Now they were understanding the structure of it. Not confusion. Not miscommunication. A pattern. Daniel moved to the next slide. This one showed the second transfer from my father's personal account. September 10th, 2025, $14,800. Travel extension, no embellishment. No extra notes beyond the date and amount. He looked back at the guests and said, at the same time Emily was being told there was no support available for her wedding, additional money was being used to extend the trip that caused the conflict. A man from my father's side of the family leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen like he was trying to recalculate what he'd just heard. One of my cousins quietly started crying. My uncle, the one who walked me down the aisle, remained completely still. His jaw had tightened, but he didn't say anything. Daniel clicked again. This time the screen showed a still image from the ceremony. The moment my parents stood up to leave. You could see the aisle, the rows of white chairs, the side profile of my father, my mother moving beside him. Then he played the short video clip. My father's voice came through the speakers clearly. Not distorted. Not edited. Just clear. "Your mother and I won't be part of this mistake." That line settled over the room heavily. Daniel stopped the video after a few seconds. Then he said, "This happened after the trust transfer, after the venue emails, and after the requests to move the date were refused." Again, it wasn't dramatic. He was placing each item where it belonged. By then, no one was eating anymore. A few people had folded their napkins and set them aside. Others were sitting with both hands around their water glasses like they needed something steady to hold. I looked around the room and noticed something I hadn't expected. People didn't look entertained. They looked sad. That changed something in me too, because sadness meant they understood this was real. Daniel kept going. The next slide was a financial breakdown of the wedding. Venue, catering, photography, flowers, dress, transportation, total cost. Then a simple line beneath it, paid from Emily and Daniel's savings. Family contribution, $0, he explained, very briefly, that we had saved for years and covered the wedding ourselves. He didn't say it to prove anything about us. He said it to complete the record. Then came the final section. A summary slide. Not angry, not triumphant, just direct. Trust funds reassigned venue interference, attempted support withdrawn, public departure during ceremony, 4 lines. That was all. Daniel looked around the room for a second before he spoke. "If anyone here has been told a different version of events," he said, "I understand that. But this is the documented version." Then he lowered the microphone slightly. "And because these documents may matter later, I brought printed copies." At that point, he lifted 3 manila folders from the table beside the DJ booth and set them where people could see them. That detail changed the feeling in the room again. This wasn't theater. It was record keeping. I put the phone face down beside my plate and looked at the screen one more time. The next step, I realized, would not be emotional. It would be procedural. And somewhere across the room, just as Daniel clicked to the last black slide, a chair scraped against the floor. Someone was standing up. The chair that scraped back was my aunt's, my father's older sister. She stood slowly, one hand resting on the edge of the table as if she needed a second to steady herself. Her face looked pale under the reception lights. For a moment, no one spoke. Then she turned, not toward me, but toward the 2 empty seats at the parents' table. And in a voice that was not loud, but carried clearly through the room, she said, "I did not know any of this." No one answered her. She sat back down carefully and pressed a folded napkin to her mouth. That was the first reaction. After that, others followed. Not all at once. Not chaotically. Just small, human responses. A cousin leaned toward another cousin and whispered something. One of my mother's friends shook her head slowly. An older man from my father's business circle stood up, picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, and left the ballroom without saying a word. Daniel stayed where he was for another few seconds. Then he set the microphone down. He didn't make a closing speech. He didn't ask for applause. He simply returned to our table and sat beside me. "That's all," he said quietly. I nodded once. Across the room, people were still looking at the screen, then at the empty seats, then at each other. The DJ remained frozen by his equipment, unsure what to do. Eventually, he lowered the music volume that was already off and just stood there waiting. My uncle was the next person to stand. He walked across the room in a straight line, his shoulders square, his expression set. For 1 second, I thought he might go outside and call my father immediately. Instead, he walked to the table by the screen, picked up one of the manila folders, opened it, and began reading. That image stayed with me. My uncle in a dark suit under soft ballroom lighting, reading printed records at a wedding reception like he was reviewing bids for a construction contract. Careful, quiet, serious. After a minute, he closed the folder and looked over at me. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "I can't believe this." He just gave one small nod. It meant more than a long speech would have. Then something happened that I had not expected. A woman from one of the tables near the back began clapping. Just once at first. Then again. It wasn't celebratory. It was almost respectful. A few others joined in. Then more. Within seconds, a large part of the room was on its feet. Not everyone. Some people remained seated. A few left altogether. But many stood. The applause wasn't for spectacle. It felt more like recognition. Like people had just watched something uncomfortable and honest and didn't know what else to do with their hands. I stayed seated for the first few seconds. Then Daniel took my hand under the table. I stood beside him. The applause faded naturally. No one tried to turn it into a moment bigger than it was. That mattered to me too, because I didn't want the reception to become a performance. I just wanted the facts to be seen. Once the room settled, people began moving again in small groups. My aunt came first. She approached slowly, mascara slightly smudged, her hands clasped together. "Emily," she said, stopping beside the table. Her voice shook a little. I truly didn't know. I believed her. "You don't need to explain," I said. She looked relieved and sad at the same time. Then she glanced at Daniel. "That was very clear," she said carefully. Daniel nodded. "That was the goal." She touched my shoulder lightly, then stepped away. My uncle came next. He still had the folder in his hand. "These are copies?" he asked Daniel. "Yes." "Good." He looked at me. "Your grandfather would have wanted the paperwork kept clean." That was exactly the kind of thing he would say. I almost smiled. Then my uncle added, "Whatever happens next, don't argue with anybody tonight. Don't explain. Don't answer calls. Let the documents do the talking." I nodded. That was already my instinct. It helped to hear him say it. Over the next half hour, the room broke into two kinds of people. The first kind wanted details immediately. They came over in low voices and asked practical questions. When was the transfer made? Did the venue really get those emails? Was that from the trust account? Do you already have legal counsel? The second kind didn't ask questions at all. They just touched my arm, hugged me briefly, or stood with me for a moment in silence before walking away. Both responses felt human. Both felt real. At one point, I noticed my phone lighting up repeatedly on the table. Message after message. Call after call. I didn't pick it up. I turned it face down. Then I left it there. A little later, Daniel's phone started doing the same thing. He checked the screen once, then locked it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Not tonight," he said. No, I agreed. Not tonight. The DJ eventually came over to our table looking almost apologetic. "Do you want me to keep things going?" he asked. His voice was careful, as if he wasn't sure whether music would be inappropriate now. I looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. Then I said, "Yes, please." The DJ nodded quickly, almost grateful to have a clear instruction. A few minutes later, soft music started again. Not the upbeat dance set yet. Just something smooth in the background while people regrouped. Servers quietly cleared plates. Glasses were refilled. The projector screen went dark. The room began, slowly, to become a wedding reception again. Only now the atmosphere was different. Cleaner somehow. Not cheerful in a simple way, but honest. I realized then that confrontation doesn't always look like raised voices or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it looks like sitting still while other people finally absorb the truth. Sometimes it looks like not interrupting when the facts are enough. That was the shift for me. I no longer felt like I had something to defend. The record had already been established. Around 9:15 p.m., one of my cousins came over and bent down beside my chair. "She's calling everybody," she said quietly. "Who?" "Your mom." I looked up at her. She called Aunt Susan. She called Grandma's old friend. She called two people from Table 6. She's trying to say the presentation was cruel and misleading. I listened without reacting. "Did it work?" I asked. My cousin glanced toward the stack of remaining folders. "No," she said. That answer told me everything I needed to know. Because once people had seen the original documents, there wasn't much left to debate. My cousin straightened and added, "Your father apparently wants to speak to you." I took a sip of water. "Not tonight." She nodded. "Good." Then she walked back to her table. A little later, one of my father's longtime business associates approached Daniel near the bar. I could only hear part of the conversation, but I watched the man gesture once toward the folders, then toward the empty seats, then shake his head. Daniel listened. He didn't argue. He didn't elaborate. He simply handed the man one sheet from the packet. The man read it for less than a minute, folded it, and placed it carefully in the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Then he left. Again, no drama, just consequence. One person at a time. By 10 p.m., the dance floor had filled. Not because anyone had forgotten what happened, but because the truth had settled where it needed to settle, and people were ready to move again. My maid of honor pulled me out onto the floor. Daniel followed a second later. The music was louder now. Shoes moved across the wood. Laughter returned in pieces. At one point, I looked around the room and noticed the two empty seats at the parents' tables still untouched. The name cards were still there. No one had removed them. And for the first time all day, they didn't make me feel abandoned. They just looked accurate. Near the end of the evening, when the room had thinned out and only close friends and family remained, Daniel and I finally sat down for a minute beside the cake table. The ballroom smelled faintly of vanilla icing, coffee, and candle wax. Someone had dimmed the lights slightly. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled. Daniel looked over at me. "You okay?" "Yes," I said. And again, I meant it. Because the hardest part was over now. What came next would be slower. Phone calls. Records. Lawyers. Explanations made through proper channels. Not through family pressure. Not through guilt. Through process. I picked up one of the remaining folders and rested it on my lap. Then I looked at Daniel and said, "Tomorrow morning, we make a list." He nodded. I already knew what the list would look like. Step 1, preserve every message and document. Step 2, do not respond emotionally. Step 3, find the right attorney. Then I closed the folder. And for the first time that night, I felt ready for morning. The morning after the wedding was very quiet. Daniel and I woke up in the hotel suite just after 8. The room still smelled faintly of flowers and hairspray from the night before. Someone had placed leftover cake in a small box on the coffee table. For a few minutes, we just sat there. Neither of us checked our phones yet. The sunlight coming through the window felt unusually calm compared to everything that had happened. Finally, Daniel reached for his phone. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded. The moment he turned it on, the screen filled with notifications. Calls. Messages. Voicemails. Mine looked the same. Friends checking in. Relatives sending short notes. A few people asking for copies of the documents. And several missed calls from numbers I recognized immediately. My parents. I didn't call back. Instead, I placed the phone down on the table again. Then I made coffee with a small hotel machine and sat beside Daniel while he began organizing the documents again. Because now that the reception was over, the situation had moved into a different phase. Not emotional. Procedural. That afternoon, one message stood out. It came from someone we didn't know. A short email from a local attorney who specialized in trust litigation. He had seen a post online about what happened at the reception. The post included a photo of the projection screen and part of the timeline. The attorney's message was simple. If the trust documents were accurate, he wrote, then the transfer could represent a breach of fiduciary duty. He offered to review everything. Daniel and I scheduled a meeting 2 days later. The attorney's office was downtown on the 7th floor of a glass building overlooking the city. The room smelled faintly like paper and leather. He spent almost an hour reviewing the documents, the trust agreement, the account transfers, the email chain with the venue. He didn't react emotionally to any of it. He simply read. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "You have a very clear timeline," he said. Daniel nodded. That was intentional. The attorney tapped the trust clause with his pen. The trustees had authority to manage the account, he explained. But they also had a legal duty to act in the beneficiary's interest. He slid the transfer record forward. Moving most of the funds to someone else would likely violate that duty. I listened quietly. "Meaning what?" I asked. "Meaning you could request restoration of the funds." He paused. "And potentially damages." Daniel asked the practical question. "How long would a case like that take?" The attorney thought for a moment. "If they cooperate, a few weeks. If they fight, several months." Then he added one more sentence. "Given the documentation, cooperation would be the wiser choice." The paperwork was filed 3 days later. A formal complaint outlining the trust terms and the transfer history. Everything that had been shown at the reception now existed in an official legal document. Once that happened, things moved quickly. Within a week, my parents' attorney contacted ours requesting mediation. No statements to the press, no public interviews, just negotiation. The mediation took place in a quiet conference center on the edge of the city. Daniel and I sat in one room with our attorney. My parents sat in another room with theirs. We didn't see each other. The mediator moved between rooms carrying proposals. It lasted most of the morning. Eventually, the mediator returned with the final offer: restoration of the full trust amount, additional financial compensation, and legal fees. The total came to $180,000. There was one condition: no public commentary about the settlement. I thought about it for a moment. Then I added one request of my own. A written acknowledgement, I said. The mediator looked at me. Of what? Of the trust violation. He left the room. 20 minutes later, he returned. They've agreed. The document arrived by certified mail a few days later. One page, signed by both of my parents. It acknowledged that the trust had been mishandled and that the transfer should not have occurred. I read it once. Then I placed it in a folder with the other records. Daniel asked me how I felt about it. I told him the truth. It closes the account, I said. Nothing more. Nothing less. The funds arrived the following week. A wire transfer marked settlement. Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the account screen for a while. Not celebrating, just absorbing the moment. Eventually, Daniel said, "What do you want to do with it?" I thought about that. My grandparents had created the trust to help start a life. So that's what we did. A few months later, we used part of the money as the down payment on a small house outside the city. 3 bedrooms, a quiet street, a backyard with enough space for a garden. The rest of the settlement stayed in savings. Not as a victory, just as a resource. Life settled into a new routine after that. Daniel went back to work. I returned to my nonprofit program. We unpacked boxes, painted walls, and slowly turned the house into a place that felt like ours. My parents didn't call. My sister's social media posts became less frequent. For a while, the story circulated online. Then it faded, like most things eventually do. And I was fine with that, because the real resolution wasn't public attention. It was something much simpler: a timeline corrected, an account restored, and a boundary that finally held. About 6 months after the wedding, life felt very ordinary again. Daniel and I were standing in the kitchen of our new house on a quiet Saturday morning. The windows were open, and a cool breeze moved the curtains slightly. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started, then faded into the background. I was rinsing a coffee mug in the sink while Daniel sat at the table going through a stack of documents. Not legal documents this time. House paperwork. Insurance forms. A small binder labeled Future Planning. He had started organizing it the week after we moved in. I dried the mug with a towel and leaned against the counter. "What are you working on?" I asked. He turned one of the pages around so I could see it. It was a draft of a trust document. Not a large one, just a basic structure. For later, he said. I understood immediately. A plan for the family we hoped to build. I sat down across from him and looked at the page for a moment. Then I said something that had been in my mind for a while. "If we ever leave money for someone," I said, "I want the instructions to be simple." Daniel looked up. "How simple?" I thought about my grandparents for a moment. They had tried to do something generous. The system around it had complicated things. Finally, I said something like, "Use this to build a life that makes you happy." Daniel nodded slowly. "I like that." Then he wrote the sentence down. Our days after that were quiet. Work during the week. Groceries on Sundays. Sometimes dinner with Daniel's parents. Sometimes visits with my uncle and aunt, who had become much closer to us after everything that happened. My parents remained distant. There were a few messages passed indirectly through relatives. Questions about how we were doing. A request once about meeting for coffee. I didn't say yes. Not yet. Some conversations require time before they're possible again. And time moves at its own pace. One evening near the end of spring, I was walking through the small nursery we had begun preparing. The walls were painted a soft pale yellow. Daniel was assembling the crib in the corner. The room smelled faintly of fresh paint and new wood. I stood there quietly for a moment, watching him work. Then he looked up. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. But what I was thinking about was the day of the wedding. The empty seats. The documents on the screen. The way the room had slowly understood the truth without anyone raising their voice. It felt far away now. Not erased. Just settled. Sometimes people ask me what the lesson of the whole situation was. They expect something dramatic. But honestly, the answer is much simpler. Keep records. Pay attention to patterns. And when something important needs to be clarified, do it calmly and with facts. Not everything in life requires confrontation. But when it does, quiet clarity tends to last longer than anger. A few weeks ago, something interesting happened. A woman from another city wrote to me after hearing the story through a mutual friend. Her situation sounded familiar. Family money, expectations, pressure tied to a wedding date. She didn't ask for advice exactly. She just asked how I stayed calm when everything felt unfair. I told her the same thing I told Daniel the night we looked at those documents for the first time. Start by organizing the information. Once the facts are clear, the next step usually becomes obvious. Maybe someday I'll tell that story too. But that's for another time. For now, things here are peaceful. The house is quiet in the mornings. The coffee is usually strong. And Daniel still keeps the paperwork binder on the kitchen table. Sometimes life becomes simpler after the truth is placed exactly where it belongs. If you stayed with me through this entire story, thank you. If you enjoyed listening, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories. I'm always curious where people are listening from, so leave a comment and tell me what city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Also, when this video ends, two of the most popular stories from this channel will appear on your screen next. They're worth a listen if you enjoy calm, real-life situations like this one. Until then, take care of yourself, keep your records organized, and I'll see you in the next story.